I'm Steve Boilard with the LAO's Education section. We just released our report on the Governor's 2012-13 higher education budget proposal. In the next few minutes, we're going to discuss four broad themes from our report. First, we examine the higher education budget in historical context. This helps to answer the question, how has higher education been affected by the state's recent budget constraints? There's no one way to answer that question. For example, you can look at general fund support, and that has actually declined. This somewhat overstates, though, the effect on higher education programs because the higher education segments have been able to replace a lot of that funding with tuition and fee revenue. For this reason, we look at a broad range of all core fund sources, including general fund, tuition, local property taxes, federal funds, lottery, and other core sources. Another common way of looking at higher education funding effects is the change from one year to the next. This can somewhat understate the effect of higher education programs because there's been a cumulative effect over the years of successive reductions. For this reason, we make our comparisons to 2007-8, which we consider to be the last normal year of higher education funding. And that year, all the segments received their normal COLA, their enrollment growth funding. There were no unallocated reductions. What you do see that's pretty clear in terms of overall effect on higher education funding has been a shift in cost more towards students. And you can see this in the figure. As you see in the figure that student costs that you see are about a little over 50%. They're covering more than 50% of the cost of their education. At Cal State, it's roughly half, and at community colleges, it's about 20%. This is up substantially from where it was a few years ago, where UC and CSU was more like 33% and maybe a quarter. Community colleges are between 5 and 10%. Still, overall, the student share of cost at UC, CSU, community colleges is considerably less than it is at other states. Second broad theme in our report is the governor's new approach to budgeting for UC, CSU, and the community colleges. Overall, this new approach involves removing a number of state controls, budgetary controls on the segments, granting them more autonomy, promising increases in funding in subsequent years, contingent upon their meeting some as yet undefined performance targets. In the figure, you see one example of how these constraints are being lifted. There's a number of earmarks you see here, and these are all in the current year budget. All of these would be removed. There's funding for AIDS research, there's funding for math and science, teacher initiative at the California State University system. Instead, the universities receive their funding without any specific direction towards particular programs, and it would be up to them to spend the money as they saw fit. Another important component of this granting of flexibility is the governor takes funding that up to this point has been separately budgeted for retirement costs and for general obligation bond debt. These costs normally are funded outside of the university budgets. The governor would take the money and roll it into their base budgets and then allow them to use this funding as they saw fit in subsequent years. They would be responsible for paying any changes in cost to retirement and bond debt costs. In terms of the annual increases, each university and the community colleges would receive 4% annual base increases in their general fund support starting in 2013-14. This again would be contingent upon their meeting some kind of performance targets. The governor does not yet specify exactly how those performance targets would be set up. Overall, we're concerned that this approach is going to really undermine the legislature's authority in being able to allocate funding towards its priorities. It undermines some budgetary controls that have been placed upon the universities and colleges. And in addition, we're concerned that these promised out-year automatic funding increases are in no way tied to actual costs and no way tied to the ability of the state to pay for them. We do, however, appreciate that the governor is interested in accountability and encourage the legislature to work with him in developing some robust accountability mechanisms. A third broad theme in our report is that of financial aid. This is where the governor places all of his budget savings in higher education. There's over $300 million in reductions to the state's Cal Grant programs, for example. The way he achieves most of the Cal Grant savings is by tightening eligibility requirements for the Cal Grant program, primarily in the area of increasing GPA requirements. As you can see in the chart, there is a direct correlation between a student's GPA coming out of high school and their likelihood to succeed and complete in their college or university work. So there is a reasonable linkage between GPA and student success. We are concerned, however, that some of these GPA thresholds are too high. For example, he does have part of these grants that would be dependent upon a 3.25 grade point average. The governor's proposal also reduces the amount of grants available to students at private, for-profit, and nonprofit institutions. Overall, we agree with the governor that there's a need to control costs in the Cal Grant program, but we offer some alternative ways to do this that would have a better impact for students and for the state. A large financial aid program the governor does not address is that of the Board of Governors fee waiver program at the community colleges. This is a program that waives fees for all students who can demonstrate any financial need. As you can see in the chart, the costs of this program have been increasing considerably. The chart shows the amount of fees that are collected at the bottom and the amount of fees that are waived at the top of each bar. You see that the amount of fees waived has been increasing considerably to the point where the governor projects for next year 70% of students will not pay fees at the community colleges. What we suggest are some ways to rein in the cost of this program and to better leverage a program to increase student success. Finally, we identify a fourth theme in the governor's budget, that of trigger cuts. The governor's budget relies upon considerable revenue coming in as a result of temporary tax increases that the governor proposes to put before voters in November. In the event that the voters do not approve those increases, the governor proposes $5.3 billion in mid-year cuts that would fall largely on K-12 schools and higher education. For higher education, this means $200 million mid-year reductions to UC and CSU each, and about $300 million of cuts to the community colleges. We understand and appreciate that there's a need to have contingencies in place in the event that this revenue does not materialize. However, the legislature does have choices in how it could structure triggers. For example, the legislature could spread those triggers over a larger number of programs to reduce the threat to any one particular program. Alternatively, the legislature could build the budget, take the exact opposite approach as the governor, and build the budget without assuming increased revenue. And then in the event that revenues do come in November, those can be directed towards critical one-time costs. You will find a fuller discussion of all four themes, as well as additional information and recommendations in a report which is available online. Thanks for watching.